They tied a black CEO to his seat, but his son, a federal inspector, was quietly watching, and the crew had no idea what was coming next. They tied the black CEO to his seat, thinking no one would intervene. They didn't realize his son was the federal inspector, quietly watching, ready to act. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always meets unstoppable authority. The office door clicked shut behind him, and David Harrow felt the familiar weight of the city's skyline pressing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. The glow of New Cordelia's night lights shimmered across the glass, reflecting off the polished surface of his desk. In front of him lay a neatly stacked array of confidential reports, each sheet a small fragment of the empire he had built. He picked up the top one, skimming the numbers, the projections, the potential pitfalls. His fingers tapped lightly on the edge of the desk, a rhythm he often used when thinking. But tonight, the usual clarity eluded him. A strange tension had settled in his chest, an unease he couldn't shake. David had faced high-stakes decisions before, negotiated with the toughest competitors, and navigated boardroom battles that could topple lesser men. Yet, as he scanned the quarterly projections for Zenith Corp's ambitious international expansion, an almost imperceptible flicker of worry passed through him. Something wasn't right. The patterns of market activity seemed slightly off, subtle, almost invisible unless one knew exactly what to look for. And David did. Unseen by him, across the city, a shadowed office in a nondescript building hummed with quiet activity. Marcus Vale, the head of Vexline, leaned back in a leather chair, his sharp eyes tracking multiple screens displaying Zenith Corp's operations. A slow, satisfied smile tugged at his lips. "They have no idea what's coming," he murmured, voice low and deliberate, each word measured like a chess piece being moved across a board. His fingers drummed impatiently on the armrest as he reviewed the plans that could cripple David and force Zenith Corp into a corner. Marcus thrived on control, on the thrill of manipulating others without them realizing it. Tonight, he had everything set into motion. Back in David's office, he leaned back, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The weight of responsibility bore down on him, not just for the company, but for the hundreds of employees whose livelihoods depended on his decisions. The launch scheduled in the coming weeks was meant to be Zenith Corp's crowning achievement, a technological marvel that could cement their dominance on the international stage. But even as he reviewed the product's specifications and marketing projections, a nagging thought gnawed at the edge of his mind. What if someone was waiting for the perfect moment to strike? His reverie was interrupted by the faint hum of the air conditioning and the soft tap of his pen against the polished mahogany surface. It was routine, almost hypnotic, but David's trained senses noted every slight variation in the environment. The subtle creak of the floorboards outside, the shadows shifting as the city lights danced across his office. Every instinct told him that something unseen was at play, a presence just beyond the periphery of his awareness. Yet he pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the meticulous reports before him, dissecting revenue forecasts, regional projections, and potential investor concerns. Meanwhile, at home, his teenage son Ethan hunched over a laptop, the soft glow illuminating his focused expression. Papers strewn across the desk detailed his latest FBI internship project, and the occasional notes scribbled in the margins hinted at a mind constantly at work. Ethan didn't sense the brewing storm outside, didn't yet know that his father's world was about to collide with forces that could alter everything. His concentration was absolute, a reflection of inherited analytical skill and relentless curiosity. The city's usual night hum filtered in through the open window, masking the tension that David felt miles away. David leaned forward, scanning a particularly complex report, his mind working through contingencies. He considered every angle, every potential response, and yet, despite his preparation, a shadow of doubt lingered. He ran a hand through his dark hair, tension tightening his jaw, and muttered under his breath, "Something's off, far off." It was a quiet acknowledgement of the storm he could not yet see. The office felt unusually quiet, the hum of the city outside a stark contrast to the rapid calculations spinning through his mind. Every tick of the clock seemed heavier than the last, each second stretching with a weight that pressed against his chest. He straightened in his chair, eyes narrowing, as if the right answer might appear in the reflection of the skyline. Yet, despite his intellect, despite years of experience, the night carried an invisible tension that no report, no calculation could capture. And then, a subtle shift in the shadows of the office, a movement too quick to be casual, too deliberate to be coincidental, made David sit upright. His mind sharpened, every instinct screaming caution. He didn't yet see the threat fully, didn't yet understand the danger at his doorstep, but he felt it. He could feel the gears of a plan turning just beyond his perception, a game being played in which he was the unwitting centerpiece. Little did David know, his biggest battle was about to come through the door. Late that night, David's office doors slammed open with a force that made the glass panels tremble. Two masked men rushed in, moving with a mechanical precision that betrayed their experience. Before David could fully process what was happening, thick ropes were looped around his wrists and ankles, and within seconds he found himself bound tightly to his own leather executive chair. The cool, metallic scent of the office air mixed with the faint tang of his own adrenaline. Panic flickered across his normally composed features, his mind racing through every possible escape, every contingency plan he had ever devised. "Sit tight, Mr. Harrow," one of the intruders said in a low, clipped voice, his hands efficient as they secured the knots. David's chest tightened, but he forced himself to remain outwardly calm, aware that showing fear could make the situation worse. His eyes darted around the room, scanning for anything that could be used as leverage, a letter opener, a sharp edge, even a corner of the desk, but the ropes were expertly tied, leaving no immediate solution. The second intruder stepped back, giving David just enough space to realize the depth of the trap. Moments later, Marcus Vale strode in, his presence radiating confidence and control. His tailored suit reflected the overhead lights, giving him an almost predatory sheen. Marcus's smirk was slow, deliberate, as if he was savoring the moment. "Well, David," he began, his tone a mixture of amusement and calculated menace, "it seems your evening just became far more interesting." David's jaw tightened. He fought the urge to react physically, knowing the wrong move could provoke violence. "Marcus," he said evenly, keeping his voice calm despite the racing of his pulse, "what is this about? You're risking a lot by doing this." Marcus leaned casually against the polished conference table, his eyes glinting with malice. "Risk?" he repeated, as though the concept amused him. "I call it strategy. Zenith Core is on the brink of international expansion, and I intend to make sure that expansion benefits me, not you. You'll find that sometimes the only way to win in business is to remove the player entirely." He gestured subtly to the masked men, who nodded in silent acknowledgement, their eyes hidden behind dark masks. David's mind raced. He considered the implications, not just for himself, but for his company, for the employees who relied on his leadership. The ropes cut into his wrists, a physical reminder of the precarious position he now occupied. "What exactly do you want?" he asked, forcing himself to keep his voice steady, to mask the swirl of thoughts threatening to overtake him. Marcus's smirk widened. "A merger," he said plainly, "one that you will have no choice but to accept. Resistance is futile, David. And you are simply a pawn in the larger game." His words were deliberate, meant to instill fear, but also to hint at the intricacies of a plan that David could not yet fully see. Marcus lingered a moment longer, letting the tension in the room build, then turned on his heel and left, his footsteps echoing ominously down the hallway. The masked men followed without a word, their movements silent but precise. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving David alone in the dimly lit office. A soft hum of the building's ventilation was the only sound as David's eyes adjusted to the subdued light. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the uncertainty, the isolation, and the looming threat of Marcus's next move. Every detail of the office seemed magnified in the silence. The faint reflection of the skyline in the windows, the neatly stacked reports on his desk, the small clock ticking inexorably on the wall. David's mind refused to settle. He considered the potential ramifications for Zenith Core: investors, board members, employees, partners abroad. Could the company survive if he remained incapacitated? What did Marcus truly want beyond money? The questions twisted in his mind like a storm, each one demanding an answer he could not yet find. From the hallway outside, a silent figure monitored the security feeds, ensuring that no alarms would trigger. Every camera, every corridor, every blind spot was accounted for. David could not see this accomplice, but he could sense the orchestration of control beyond the immediate room. The meticulousness of it gnawed at him. He realized this was not a simple act of aggression, but a calculated maneuver, each step designed to weaken him psychologically as much as physically. David took a slow, deliberate breath. He had faced high-pressure negotiations, hostile takeovers, and boardroom betrayals before, but this was different. The stakes were no longer financial. They were personal, immediate, and unpredictable. He felt a spark of determination ignite in the core of his mind, a reminder of the resilience that had built his empire. The ropes might hold him now, but they could not restrain his thoughts, his strategic mind, his will to survive. As he adjusted slightly in the chair, testing the limits of his bindings, David realized the magnitude of what had occurred. Marcus's plan was more than a kidnapping. It was a tactical strike in a larger game, one David hadn't yet fully understood. Every second that ticked by was both a threat and an opportunity. He was trapped, yet aware of the first glimmers of the counterplay he would need to mount. David's gaze fixed on the door, imagining the board's reaction if he failed to appear, the employees depending on his leadership. In that suspended moment, clarity emerged through the haze of fear. He knew he had to think several steps ahead, anticipate Marcus's arrogance, and leverage every tiny advantage the room might offer. David realized this was no ordinary kidnapping. It was a chess move in a game he hadn't seen coming. Marcus Vale leaned over the long, metal table in the dimly lit warehouse, his eyes scanning the documents spread before him like a general surveying a battlefield. The faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead reflected off the concrete floor, giving the space a cold, clinical feel. Around him, his inner circle, men handpicked for their ruthlessness and loyalty, stood in tense anticipation. Marcus's voice cut through the quiet, sharp and commanding. Every step must be executed flawlessly. Zenith Core will not see us coming until it's too late. His lips curled into a faint smirk, but his eyes betrayed a calculating intensity. The team listened intently, nodding and understanding, their faces a mix of eagerness and respect. Surveillance assignments were detailed with exact locations, hours, and potential blind spots. One operative, a tall man with a sharp jawline, tapped notes into a sleek tablet, the glow reflecting off his glasses. Another operative, stockier with a perpetual frown, studied blueprints of Zenith Core's office, marking escape routes and security camera positions. Marcus's hand hovered over a diagram of the CEO's office, his finger tracing the probable path David might take in an emergency. "Do not underestimate him," Marcus warned, his tone low but unwavering. "David Harrow is cunning. He will anticipate, he will resist, but we have to anticipate his moves before he even thinks of them." The group discussed misinformation campaigns next, false leaks, planted rumors, and subtle manipulation of investors' perceptions. Each detail was laid bare with meticulous precision. "If we control the narrative, we control the outcome," Marcus said, his voice smooth but cold. He paused, scanning the faces of his team, ensuring the weight of his words sank in. "We cannot allow Zenith Core to recover from this. Not even a single misstep can occur." Meanwhile, across the city, Ethan Harrow sat hunched over his laptop in his small apartment, the glow of the screen casting shadows across his concentrated face. His eyes darted between live security feeds, digital logs, and fragmented notifications of unusual activity near his father's office. Every anomaly, an unexpected door opening, a van parked unusually close, A faint shadow passing a window set off a series of analytical alarms in his mind. He leaned back, rubbing his temple, trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't yet have all its parts. Ethan's mind raced. "Something's off," he muttered under his breath, his fingers tapping the keyboard with precision. He traced patterns, matched timestamps, and cross-referenced personnel movements. The pieces of a troubling picture slowly began to align. Finally, the implications struck him. His father, David, was in danger, real, immediate danger. The thought sent a chill down his spine, but Ethan's determination sharpened rather than faltered. He picked up his phone and dialed his mentor at the federal agency, his voice steady despite the tremor he felt inside. "I need guidance. Something unusual is happening at Zenith Core. My father may be in serious trouble." As the line connected, Ethan's eyes never left the flickering screen, analyzing the building's layout, security patterns, and movement outside. Every detail mattered. Every second could mean the difference between containment and catastrophe. In the shadows of the city, a quiet chain reaction began to unfold. Federal agents, alerted to the anomaly, started tracing the patterns Ethan provided. Back in the warehouse, Marcus and his team continued their planning, unaware that the first threads of their unraveling had already been set in motion. The contrast between the two scenes was stark. Marcus's confidence and strategic arrogance in the warehouse, and Ethan's careful, calculated vigilance across town. Dramatic irony hung in the air like a taut wire. The antagonist believed his plans were untouchable, yet the son of the target was quietly orchestrating the beginning of a countermove. As Ethan hung up the phone, a sense of grim determination settled over him. He leaned forward, scanning once more, noting subtle inconsistencies. A security guard checking a phone at unusual hours, a door that remained slightly ajar. "This is bigger than I thought," he whispered, a mix of fear and resolve tightening his jaw. He understood instinctively that every observation, every connection he made, could tip the scales in a situation that was already spiraling into danger. At the warehouse, Marcus glanced at the clock, his face illuminated by the cold fluorescent light. "Move out tomorrow at first light," he ordered, his voice even but filled with a threatening undertone. "Zenith Core will bend, and there will be nothing they can do to stop it." His inner circle nodded, their confidence mirroring his own, completely unaware that the quiet analysis of a young, brilliant observer had already begun setting the stage for an unforeseen disruption. Across the city, Ethan paused, his finger hovering over the keyboard as he mapped out his next steps. He knew he was only beginning to scratch the surface of the danger, yet his instincts screamed that the truth was close. The tension built, a taut line connecting the two scenes, one of ruthless ambition and meticulous planning, the other of vigilant intellect and quiet courage. In that moment, both father and son were unknowingly converging on the same critical point. One was trapped, the other closing in. Ethan knew his father's peril, but what he didn't yet understand was how close he already was to the truth. David's eyes flicked around the office, taking in every shadow, every inch of the furniture, and the positions of the two guards who paced methodically near the entrance. The ropes bit into his wrists and ankles, a constant reminder of his vulnerability, yet he refused to let panic take hold. Each muscle in his body was tense, poised for action, his mind running through a sequence of strategies like a high-stakes game of chess. He shifted slightly in the chair, testing the restraints with subtle movements, calculating exactly how much force he could exert without drawing attention. The hum of the city outside was a low, almost mocking contrast to the storm inside his thoughts. Lights from the skyline flickered through the blinds, casting fractured patterns across the polished floor, a reminder that the world continued to move even as he sat trapped. David focused on his breathing, steadying it, counting silently to control the rising adrenaline. Panic would be a luxury he could not afford. He replayed in his mind the techniques he had practiced over years, corporate negotiation tactics that had once turned boardroom defeats into victories, and self-defense skills honed during quiet hours of training, never anticipating they might be used in such a literal fight for survival. "Think, David, think," he murmured under his breath, the words more of a mantra than a plea. His voice was low, barely audible over the faint scrape of shoes on marble, but it anchored him in the moment. He scrutinized the guard's movements, noting how one tended to glance at the office window every few minutes while the other checked the hallway cameras with predictable regularity. Patterns emerged in the chaos, a rhythm he could exploit if he timed his actions precisely. His gaze fell on the furniture, a heavy desk with sharp corners, a filing cabinet that might serve as a shield, and the polished floor trim where he noticed a tiny, glinting shard of metal, probably dislodged during recent renovations. A seed of hope formed. That shard could be a key, a tool that might transform his helplessness into leverage. Yet, he had to be patient. One wrong move could alert the guards and ruin any chance of escape. David's mind wandered briefly to the boardroom, to the employees relying on his leadership, to the investors who trusted his judgment. He imagined their reaction if he failed to return on time. Zenith Corp's future hanging precariously in the balance. Each thought strengthened his resolve. He visualized a counter-strategy in meticulous detail, how he could manipulate the guards' expectations, create diversions, and turn Marcus Vale's confidence into a trap. It was a gamble, and the stakes were nothing less than his life and the fate of his company. Every sound, every flicker of light became part of his analysis. The distant sirens of the city, the subtle squeak of a chair leg under tension, even the muffled hum of the building's ventilation system, all were data points he absorbed, cataloging instinctively. He realized that the key to surviving this ordeal lay not in brute strength, but in exploiting perception, misdirection, and timing. Minutes stretched like hours, the tension coiling tighter with each passing second. David's pulse quickened in sync with his thoughts, a rhythmic reminder that patience and action must be perfectly balanced. He imagined how Marcus, sitting comfortably in his own safe environment, believed he had already won. That arrogance was David's unseen ally, a weakness he could exploit if he struck precisely at the right moment. He shifted again, carefully adjusting his weight in the chair, testing how much leverage he could gain without drawing attention. The ropes strained, a small but meaningful victory. A plan began to crystallize, a sequence of calculated moves that could either secure his freedom or worsen his predicament if misexecuted. Every detail mattered. The angle of the chair, the timing of guard rotations, the subtle manipulation of light and shadow. David paused, letting the silence fill the room, the city's distant pulse a counterpoint to the storm of thoughts in his mind. He imagined the first move, then the second, then a series of cascading actions that might turn his apparent helplessness into an advantage. It required perfect precision, unwavering focus, and the courage to act decisively. For the first time since the abduction, a flicker of control returned to him. His mind, sharp and unrelenting, began to dominate the chaos of his situation. He allowed himself a quiet, determined smile. This was a test not just of strength, but of strategy, and he had never been more ready. In his mind, David knew he had only one shot to turn the tables before it was too late. Ethan slipped through the dimly lit corridors of Zenith Corp with a calm precision that belied his age. The hum of the late-night ventilation system and the distant clatter of cleaning crews gave the building a false sense of normalcy. Yet every instinct in his body told him otherwise. His father's office was somewhere ahead, and the usual rhythm of security cameras and patrols now held sinister undertones. He clutched his federal credentials tightly, their laminated surface reflecting the muted glow of the emergency exit signs as he accessed the security terminal tucked behind a service door. The screen flickered to life, revealing a grid of monitors. Ethan's sharp eyes scanned each feed, his pulse quickening as he pinpointed the floor where David had been taken. Silently, he observed the guards, noting the subtle patterns in their movements, the slight pause by the water cooler, the way one guard absent-mindedly tapped his flashlight against his palm, the other leaning just a fraction too far against the wall. Each action became a puzzle piece, each lapse a potential advantage. Ethan's mind raced as he committed every detail to memory, aware that one misstep could alert the kidnappers to his presence. He crouched behind a low partition, barely breathing, as shadows danced across the polished floor. The city outside remained oblivious, the streetlights flickering through the tinted windows, casting long, distorted shapes that seemed almost alive in the otherwise still building. Then he saw it. A small metallic glint nestled beneath the corner of a file cabinet near the office entrance. Curiosity pricked at him, and when he reached down, he found a tiny communication device, partially concealed as if left behind by mistake. Ethan's brow furrowed as he turned it over in his hand, noting the scratched numbers and faint scratches on the buttons. This wasn't just a tool for ordinary coordination. It was a breadcrumb hinting at something much larger, a hidden layer of intrigue within Zenith Corps itself. He recognized the significance immediately. Marcus Vale wasn't just orchestrating a simple kidnapping. This was a strategic strike, a plan embedded within layers of deception and manipulation. Ethan's mind shifted gears. He considered the possibilities, calculating the odds of the guards discovering him, the routes he could take, the timing of his movements. If Marcus thinks I'm just a kid, he's gravely mistaken, he muttered under his breath, a sharp edge of determination in his voice. His words were barely audible over the faint hum of the air conditioning, but they carried the weight of his resolve. Every instinct screamed urgency, yet patience demanded that he wait for the precise moment to act. The stakes were immense. This was no simple rescue. The future of Zenith Corps, and perhaps countless lives tied to its stability, depended on his judgment. He crouched low, sliding along the edge of the hallway, the metal shard of the communication device cold against his palm. Each step was deliberate, calculated to avoid even the slightest squeak from the polished floors. Ethan's breath came in shallow, controlled bursts as he observed the guards again, memorizing their blind spots. He imagined his father inside the office, likely restrained but mentally sharp, calculating and waiting for his chance just as Ethan was now. The thought gave him a surge of determination. I can't fail him, he reminded himself, the words echoing in the quiet corridor like a silent vow. As he continued his careful reconnaissance, Ethan began to formulate a plan. Marcus's arrogance, the overconfidence that had been his undoing in boardroom negotiations, now became a potential weapon. If Ethan could manipulate perception, control timing, and anticipate the movements of the kidnappers, he could orchestrate a counterstrike from the shadows. He pictured the sequence in his mind: distractions, controlled missteps, subtle manipulations, all aimed at turning the hunters into the hunted. Every detail mattered. Every second counted, and the young intern felt the familiar thrill of strategy intertwined with the gnawing anxiety of immediate danger. The silence of the building wrapped around him like a cloak, punctuated only by the faint echo of distant footsteps and the soft click of the security doors. Ethan paused near a junction, scanning the area one final time before moving closer to the office floor. The deeper he went, the more the tension coiled inside him. Yet with each calculated step, he felt more in control, more aligned with the rhythm of the unfolding situation. The stakes crystallized in his mind. One wrong move could compromise everything, but a single, perfectly executed maneuver could save his father and dismantle Marcus's intricate scheme. He crouched behind a corner, peering at the office door ahead. The faint glow of the interior lights cast long shadows across the carpet, giving life to the otherwise still furniture. His fingers brushed against the communication device again, confirming what he had suspected. This was no ordinary kidnapping. The depth of the conspiracy suggested careful orchestration, but it also revealed Marcus's blind spots, his arrogance and assumption that a teenager would never intervene. Ethan's lips curved into a tight, determined line. He was ready. Ethan had no illusions about the danger ahead, but he was ready to face it head-on. David shifted his weight slightly in the chair, careful not to make a sound. The ropes bit into his wrists, coarse fibers pressing into his skin, but he forced himself to remain still. He exhaled slowly, letting the quiet hum of the city outside mask the subtle movements he made. His eyes swept across the office, noting every detail, the layout of the furniture, the position of the guards, and the faint glint of light reflecting off polished surfaces. Then his gaze landed on a small, jagged metal shard embedded in the floor trim, a remnant from recent renovations. It was an insignificant-looking fragment to anyone else, but to David, it was a potential lifeline. He flexed his fingers carefully, probing the ropes against the shard without drawing attention. The fibers resisted at first, groaning softly as they rubbed against the metal, but David's calm focus allowed him to find leverage. Each tiny adjustment brought him closer to freedom, but it was a dangerous game. A misstep, a sudden creak of the floorboards, and the guard's attention would snap toward him. He forced his mind to slow, focusing only on the rhythm of his movements and the faint sounds from the hallway outside. Outside the office, footsteps echoed faintly against the polished tile. David's chest tightened, a surge of adrenaline mixing with the steely resolve he had always relied on in crises. Marcus had returned. He would be checking, inspecting, ensuring his plan was progressing without interference. The thought of Marcus' smug face, certain that David was helpless, fueled his determination. He pressed his back against the chair, letting it bear his weight as he carefully worked the shard between the rope fibers. Beads of sweat formed at his temple, but his breathing remained measured, controlled. Any sudden rise in panic could betray him. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the building, Ethan sat before the bank of monitors in the security hub, his eyes scanning each camera feed with meticulous precision. He noticed the subtle twitch of his father's fingers, the way the ropes seemed to loosen ever so slightly, and a flicker of movement near the floor trim. His pulse quickened, but he kept his voice low, muttering to himself, "Patience. Let him work." The irony was sharp. Marcus believed David was entirely at his mercy, yet both father and son were executing a quiet, synchronized counterplay, their minds aligned across distance and walls. Ethan's analytical mind raced ahead, calculating possible contingencies, anticipating Marcus' next steps even before they unfolded. David paused, listening to the faint rustle of a guard's uniform as he shifted in the hallway. He could sense their confidence, the same overconfidence that Marcus had relied on when orchestrating the abduction. That arrogance was a weapon David intended to turn against them. He shifted his weight again, testing the ropes. The shard scraped against the fibers, and he felt a micro-tear begin to form. A tiny victory, yet it was enough to fuel the next move. He envisioned the board members, the employees depending on him, and the future of Zenith Corp, a web of responsibility that stretched far beyond his personal safety. Suddenly, a shadow flickered across the frosted glass of the office door. Marcus' presence was almost tangible, his approach deliberate, as if he could sense even the slightest disruption to his plan. David froze, pressing his body low, letting the shard remain hidden in his palm. The tension in the room thickened, palpable enough that it pressed against his temples. Any misstep could trigger disaster, yet David's mind worked with precision honed by years of high-stakes decision-making. He imagined the conversation Marcus would have with his guards, the instructions whispered in dark corners, the chain reaction of control he assumed he had over the situation. Ethan's fingers danced over the control panel, adjusting camera angles and tracking movement through vents and corridors. He noted the slight shift of his father's shoulder, the imperceptible change in posture as David tested the ropes. A silent acknowledgement passed between them, unspoken but potent. They were in sync, moving in concert toward a singular goal, freedom. The dynamic was tense, almost theatrical, each actor unaware of the full scope of the other's actions. Marcus, the presumed master of the game, was blind to the fact that his opponents were already aligning forces within his own theater of control. Minutes dragged on like hours. David's focus never wavered. His arms ached, his hands burned against the coarse fibers, yet the shard continued its patient work. Every movement was calculated, every breath measured. The room seemed to shrink around him, the shadows stretching longer as the night deepened. His mind ran through possible outcomes, each scenario branching into further contingencies. Escape was no longer a distant hope. It was a precise plan being carefully executed in real time, contingent upon patience, observation, and timing. The metallic scrape of the shard finally yielded a faint snap, the first tangible progress. David exhaled quietly, allowing a fleeting sense of satisfaction, and immediately refocused. Outside, the soft shuffle of footsteps grew louder, closer. Marcus' approach was imminent. David knew he had to maintain the illusion of helplessness while simultaneously preparing for the moment to act. His mind danced across strategies, blending brute force with misdirection, turning the very ropes meant to imprison him into tools of liberation. Ethan's gaze flicked to the monitor showing the corridor. He saw the guard pause, glance toward the office door, and shift weight, oblivious to the quiet tension inside. His father's subtle movements were a code, a rhythm that Ethan intuitively understood. He allowed the thought to settle. Both of them were moving toward the same objective, each minute a step closer to turning the situation on its head. David tested the ropes one final time before the shard slipped slightly further, giving him the leverage needed to begin freeing a wrist. His heart pounded, each beat in sharp contrast to the measured control of his breathing. The city outside remained unaware of the battle unfolding in this small office, where patience and precision had become the instruments of potential salvation. He glanced at the door, at the faint shadows creeping along the hallway, and allowed a private smirk. Marcus' confidence was his weakness, and David intended to exploit it fully. Every calculation, every restraint, every quiet movement converged toward a single, vital truth. The shadows of the office, the shard of metal, the patient determination of father and son, all were converging in a silent, deadly ballet. Time was no longer an enemy. It was an ally, counting down toward the moment when the illusion of helplessness would collapse into opportunity. Every second counted, and David knew patience was as vital as action. They tightened the restraints, confident in control, unaware that every move, every angle, and every detail had already been anticipated by the boy with federal power. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always folds when real authority is present, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Marcus returned to the building with a deliberate air of authority, his polished shoes echoing against the cold, tiled corridor. In his hand, he carried a small stack of laminated instructions for the guards, each line detailing the meticulous steps for relocating David to a transport vehicle waiting in the underground garage. "Move him carefully," Marcus instructed sharply, his voice slicing through the tension in the air. "No mistakes. Zenith Corps' fate depends on this operation." His expression was unreadable, a mask of confidence hiding the faint unease that flickered when he glanced at the monitors showing his meticulously orchestrated plan. Back in the office, David's eyes narrowed as he noted every movement of the approaching guards. The metal shard he had spotted embedded in the floor trim glinted faintly under the dim emergency lighting. He shifted subtly, testing the rope's tension once more, and in a single, precise motion, he wedged the shard between the knot and the rope. His heart pounded, yet his breathing remained measured. Each second was a careful calculation. Any misstep could cost him the advantage he had painstakingly built. The first guard stepped into the room, flashlight beam sweeping over the dimly lit office. David feigned exhaustion, slumping slightly against the chair, letting his body sag as though the ordeal had drained him completely. "Tired, aren't we?" the guard said with a faint chuckle, leaning in closer to tighten the ropes. His overconfidence played directly into David's hands. Quietly, David twisted his wrist, feeling the rope begin to loosen around him. A bead of sweat slid down his temple, but he remained outwardly calm, a master of controlled panic. At the same time, elsewhere in the building, Ethan crouched behind a control panel in the security room, his fingers dancing over the keyboard. He initiated a minor power outage, plunging the corridor into darkness. The sudden blackout sent the guards scrambling, their flashlights bobbing erratically as shadows twisted along the walls. "What the? Check the circuits!" one guard shouted, his voice laced with panic as the other fumbled with the emergency lights. The confusion created the perfect opportunity David had been waiting for. With a measured tug, David slipped one arm free entirely, his muscles tensing with the effort. He remained silent, heart hammering in his chest, every nerve alert. The shadowed office became his ally, each dark corner offering concealment as the disoriented guards moved blindly, their attention divided between the feigned ropes and the failing lights. A faint click from the monitors drew Marcus's attention back to the cameras in the warehouse. His brow furrowed as the feed flickered briefly, a tiny, almost imperceptible glitch that unsettled him. "What's going on down there?" he muttered, tension creeping into his otherwise controlled tone. For the first time, the absolute certainty of his plan seemed threatened. David's mind raced. Each second had become a battlefield of anticipation and action. He calculated the guards' routines, noting the slight hesitation in their movements caused by the darkness. Every shadow held potential for maneuvering. Every sound could be exploited. He felt the thrill of danger and the weight of responsibility simultaneously. Failure wasn't just personal. It could jeopardize Zenith Corps' future. Meanwhile, Ethan's presence in the shadows, unseen yet intimately connected to the unfolding chaos, bolstered David's confidence. His son's ingenuity was invisible to the enemy, yet vital. The synergy between father and son, though unspoken, formed a silent strategy that Marcus could not anticipate. David allowed himself a fleeting sense of satisfaction. The unseen hand guiding the larger disruption belonged to someone he trusted implicitly. The guards, still fumbling with the flashlights, had no idea their control was slipping away. David's focus was absolute. He shifted again, loosening the rope further, feeling the first taste of freedom. The darkness and distraction had given him leverage he could exploit fully in the coming moments. Outside, Marcus's unease began to deepen, though he remained outwardly composed. He adjusted the camera angles, trying to detect any anomaly in the feed, but it was too late. The first real cracks in his carefully laid plan had already begun to form. The shadows became David's allies, and the unseen hand of his son added to the unfolding chaos. David's heart pounded as he slowly tested the tension of the ropes around his wrists, every subtle movement a calculated risk. The dim light from the office lamp cast long shadows across the room, mingling with the flickering glow of the city skyline beyond the windows. He shifted slightly, feeling the rough fibers bite into his skin, and noticed the smallest imperfection in the metal shard embedded in the floor trim, a remnant from the recent renovations. His mind raced, weighing the consequences of each motion. One wrong move, one slip of attention, and the guards outside could catch him in an instant. But patience was a weapon as much as speed, and David knew that he had to wait for the perfect moment. Carefully, he positioned the shard between the rope and his wrist, sawing in slow, deliberate motions. Each scraping sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room, yet the guards remained oblivious, stationed just outside, their muffled conversations echoing faintly through the door. David's thoughts were razor-sharp, analyzing every detail of the environment. The guard rotations, the location of the cameras, the predictable patterns of their footsteps. He drew on every ounce of his experience, decades of corporate maneuvering, high-pressure negotiations, and years of personal training to maintain composure. "Stay calm. One move at a time," he whispered under his breath, his voice barely audible. Finally, the rope loosened enough to give him movement. He flexed his wrist gently, testing the newfound freedom, and waited for the precise moment to act. As luck and strategy would have it, a guard stepped into the room to check on him, leaning slightly too close to inspect his restraint. In a flash, David struck, using his freed wrist to seize the guard's arm, twisting and subduing him without raising a cry. He moved quickly to take the guard's radio, pressing it to his ear to hear Marcus's voice bark instructions. With careful precision, he keyed a false message, "All secure," moving as planned, feeding Marcus confidence while concealing the truth. The thrill of the deception surged through him, but he kept his expression calm, even exhausted, as the guards slumped quietly to the floor. Meanwhile, Ethan moved through the building's service tunnels, his steps silent on the concrete floor. Every echo of distant footsteps set his nerves on edge, yet he remained focused, navigating toward strategic points where he could intercept any reinforcements Marcus might send. His eyes scanned the dimly lit corridors, taking in ventilation shafts, emergency exits, and hidden alcoves. Despite the danger, a quiet thrill ran through him. This was a test of skill, of wits, and he was ready to rise to it. The thought of his father, alone and trapped, propelled him forward, each decision a calculated measure in a larger plan they were unknowingly synchronizing. Back in the office, David continued his work, now with both arms partially free. He subdued the second guard using swift, controlled movements, ensuring not to cause permanent harm. Every muscle in his body was taut, every sense alert, yet his mind remained composed, mapping out the next steps. He recalled Marcus's arrogance, the overconfidence that had been so evident during his monologue about the hostile takeover and manipulation of the board. That pride would be a vulnerability, something David could exploit. He underestimates us, David thought, a faint smirk brushing his lips. And that will be his undoing. The room seemed to hold its breath as he paused, listening to the distant hum of the city, the faint shuffling of feet in the hall, the quiet static from the radio. It was a delicate balance. Too hasty, and the trap would collapse. Too slow, and they might lose the advantage entirely. Every element of timing had to align perfectly. The guards, the security systems, his own movements, and Ethan's unseen interventions in the tunnels. The drama of the moment pressed in from all sides, the thrill of the unfolding counterattack mingling with the ever-present threat of failure. David allowed himself a moment to visualize the plan fully. Marcus, overconfident, believing he had secured victory, the room rigged with misdirection, Ethan covering escape routes and backup threats. Each component was a piece of a larger strategy, one born of observation, patience, and precise timing. The adrenaline and focus sharpened David's senses, every creak of the floorboard or distant echo a cue in the silent symphony of their counterstrike. He adjusted his stance, every movement deliberate, readying himself to transform the situation from one of captivity to control. He glanced toward the office door, imagining Marcus's smug expression, the hubris that would blind him to the impending reversal. David could almost hear the antagonistic confidence in Marcus's voice, the same tone he had used to belittle and manipulate. That very arrogance would now be turned against him, as David prepared to orchestrate a trap from within the confines of his temporary prison. Every second was laden with tension, every shadow a potential ally or danger. The scene felt suspended in time, a quiet, electric pause before the inevitable clash. In that tense silence, the hunter and the hunted were about to switch roles. David Harrow's heart thumped with controlled intensity as he positioned himself behind the polished oak desk, every muscle taut with anticipation. The office was dimly lit, the ambient glow from the city outside casting long shadows across the walls. Each shadow seemed to stretch toward him, warning of danger, yet offering an uncanny cover. He had meticulously staged the room. Chairs slightly askew to suggest hurried activity, documents deliberately scattered, and the faint hum of the building's ventilation masking the faintest of movements. His eyes flicked toward the door, calculating the exact moment Marcus Vale would enter, and every nerve in David's body was coiled like a spring ready to strike. When the door swung open, Marcus stepped in, exuding a dangerous confidence. He was flanked by two bodyguards, their presence a silent threat. Marcus's smirk was sharp, arrogant, and unreadable, the kind of expression that had allowed him to manipulate so many powerful men before. He surveyed the room with an almost theatrical glance, clearly expecting submission, expecting David to be weakened or defeated. "I trust everything is in order," Marcus said smoothly, his voice carrying both authority and amusement. His gaze flicked toward David, assessing, testing for any sign of hesitation. David met his eyes steadily, his expression calm, but electric with unspoken calculation. "Everything's ready," he replied, his voice measured. But the calm tone belied the whirlwind of strategy spinning in his mind. He allowed just enough pause for Marcus to assume he was cornered, to allow that arrogance to take root. Every second Marcus lingered in his smugness, David gained a subtle advantage. Above them, hidden in the narrow vents threading through the ceiling, Ethan watched with hawk-like precision. His breath was steady, though his heart raced at every movement Marcus made. He was acutely aware that one misstep could unravel everything they had worked toward. Fingers poised above the control panel, he waited for David's cue, eyes tracing every guard, every shadow, and every subtle gesture. His mind ran through contingencies, predicting the possible reactions of the men below. David slowly rose, making deliberate movements that suggested compliance. Yet each step was calculated to position himself strategically. "Marcus," he began, his tone calm, almost conversational, "there's something you didn't anticipate." He gestured toward a stack of files on the desk. Marcus's brow twitched imperceptibly, a hint of irritation breaking through his confident facade. "What is this?" Marcus demanded, leaning forward, his smirk faltering slightly. His eyes scanned the papers, but his guards remained tense, hands brushing the weapons at their hips. David's gaze was sharp, unwavering. "Internal leaks, financial discrepancies, evidence of the manipulation you didn't expect anyone to uncover. I've been tracking the channels you thought were secure." Each word was precise, cutting through Marcus's assumption of control. The air in the room seemed to thicken with tension, each second stretching, pregnant with consequence. As Marcus's expression shifted from arrogance to confusion, David moved with fluid precision, subtly redirecting the attention of the guards. "Check the documents yourself," David added, his voice deceptively casual. "You'll find more than you bargained for." From above, Ethan triggered the security override, and a mechanical click resonated through the building. The doors snapped shut, electronic locks engaging with a soft but definitive hum. The bodyguards stiffened, their movements jerky, caught between instinct and surprise. Marcus's smirk wavered as he slapped at the door handles, but the locks held fast. David's mind raced, every detail synchronized with Ethan's unseen intervention. "I think it's clear now," David said, stepping forward, his presence commanding the room. "You misjudged your opponents." The air between them crackled, a collision of intellect and audacity. Marcus's face darkened, his initial shock hardening into fury. "This isn't over," he hissed, but the room, for once, seemed to close in around him, turning his calculated plan into a vulnerable exposure. David's posture remained calm, almost casual, yet his eyes betrayed the razor-sharp focus that had brought him to this moment. The bodyguards exchanged uncertain glances, sensing the sudden shift in power, their training unable to anticipate the coordinated ingenuity of father and son working as one. Each heartbeat resonated like a drum, counting down to Marcus's realization that the game had flipped entirely. In that suspended moment, Marcus's arrogance faltered completely, giving way to the stark truth of the situation. Every plan he had laid, every subtle manipulation, was now being unraveled in real time by the very people he had underestimated. David and Ethan had become the architects of his undoing without a single misstep, their minds entwined in a strategy Marcus had never considered. Marcus's eyes darted from David to the doors to the shadows of the room, searching desperately for a hidden advantage. But there was none. Every exit, every contingency had been anticipated. His voice caught as he realized the inevitability of his defeat, the power he had wielded so confidently now slipping from his grasp. And in that instant, the moment crystallized. Marcus's smirk vanished as he recognized that he was the one caught in the trap. The moment the last guard hit the ground with a stunned grunt, David's chest heaved, a mixture of adrenaline and relief coursing through him. The office, once an arena of tension and danger, now hummed with the quiet electricity of triumph. He moved quickly, securing the area and glancing at Marcus, who sat restrained on the floor, his smirk long gone and replaced with a mix of disbelief and simmering frustration. "You think this changes anything?" Marcus spat, his voice tight, eyes darting for any sign of an advantage. But David remained calm, his gaze steady and unyielding. "It changes everything," he replied, the weight of authority in his tone signaling that the battle, at least for now, was won. Ethan, emerging from the shadows near the ventilation shaft, let out a low exhale. His young face, usually animated with curiosity, now bore the determined focus of someone who had just navigated a storm. "Dad, we need to move fast," he said, checking the small tablet that displayed the building's security feeds. His fingers danced across the screen, initiating lockdown protocols and alerting the federal team waiting outside. The tension in his posture was palpable, shoulders squared, eyes scanning for any overlooked danger. David nodded in silent agreement, recognizing the precision and clarity in his son's actions. The distant wail of approaching sirens signaled the arrival of law enforcement. David gestured for Ethan to stand back, taking the lead as the first team of federal agents and police officers entered the office floor. Their boots clicked against the polished tiles, voices professional but edged with urgency. "Sir, we've got Marcus Vale and 2 accomplices secured," one of the officers reported, his eyes sweeping over the restrained men and the carefully collected evidence. David nodded, a small, tight smile forming. "Good. Make sure all digital records and communications are preserved. Every transaction, every message, every manipulation attempt needs to be documented." As the agents moved efficiently through the office, gathering Marcus's devices and documents, David felt the weight of the night's ordeal lift just enough to allow his mind to assess the broader picture. The meticulous planning Marcus had executed, from the fake messages to the hired guards, was now unraveling under the scrutiny of law enforcement. Every hidden wire, every attempt at misinformation, every manipulated ledger became evidence of an empire built on deceit. And yet, the realization was both sobering and satisfying. Zenith Corps had survived the storm. Ethan, standing slightly behind his father, watched as the agents worked, his pulse still racing. "They're going to dig deep, aren't they?" he asked, a hint of anxiety in his voice. David's hand found his son's shoulder, grounding him. "Yes, and that's exactly why we acted quickly. Marcus underestimated us both. But now the truth is out. Nothing he planned can stand against the evidence we've preserved." Ethan's eyes met his father's, a mix of pride and relief reflecting back at him. For a brief moment, the night's chaos faded, replaced by a quiet sense of achievement and mutual respect. The room was still alive with energy. Agents were speaking into radios, coordinating follow-up operations, while officers meticulously recorded every piece of incriminating material. Marcus's network, once a web of influence and intimidation, was collapsing before David's eyes. "He's going to try to fight it legally," one agent remarked quietly, surveying the gathered documents. David shook his head. "He might try, but the foundation of his empire is built on lies. This time, there's nowhere to hide." His tone carried the calm decisiveness that had defined his leadership throughout the crisis. Despite the professional flurry around him, David couldn't help but feel the personal weight of the night's events. He glanced at Ethan, noting how the boy had remained composed, intelligent, and courageous under pressure. "You did well tonight," David said, his voice low, carrying both relief and admiration. Ethan offered a modest shrug, cheeks slightly flushed from exertion and tension. "We both did what needed to be done," he said, eyes flicking back to Marcus, now silent and subdued. There was no arrogance in his voice, only a grounded awareness of the stakes and the importance of careful, deliberate action. As the last of the evidence was secured and Marcus was loaded into a separate transport vehicle, David and Ethan moved toward the office's main conference room to debrief the board. The skyline of New Cordelia outside the floor-to-ceiling windows glimmered with late-night lights, serene and indifferent to the turmoil that had just unfolded within the building. Sitting across from the board members, David spoke with clarity and authority, walking them through the chain of events, the preventative measures taken, and the steps to safeguard the company moving forward. "We were tested tonight," he said, "but Zenith Core remains intact, stronger for the vigilance and teamwork shown." Ethan quietly watched, making notes for the federal report he would later submit, his mind already considering improvements to security protocols and internal oversight. The weight of responsibility pressed upon both father and son, but it was a shared burden, one that cemented their bond in ways words could not fully capture. Outside, the city continued its nocturnal rhythm, oblivious to the near catastrophe that had just been averted. Within these walls, however, victory had been hard-won, methodical, and absolute. Finally, as the night wound down and the last of the federal authorities departed, David and Ethan stood together by the window, the cold glass of boundary between them and a world that felt, for a moment, infinitely vast and unpredictable. Exhaustion tugged at their limbs, but a sense of accomplishment warmed their spirits. David rested a hand on Ethan's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the courage, intelligence, and loyalty that had guided them through the chaos. The building was secure, Marcus contained, and Zenith Core's future ensured, not by brute force alone, but through foresight, strategy, and unwavering resolve. They had turned what seemed like inevitable defeat into a testament of strategy and courage. The aftermath unfolded with an intensity that seemed almost surreal. In the quiet glow of early morning, Zenith Core's headquarters buzzed with activity, a stark contrast to the chaos that had gripped it just hours before. Employees moved with a mixture of relief and renewed purpose, speaking in hushed tones about the events that had threatened the company's very existence. David Harrow stood at the center of it all, surveying the scene with a measured gaze, the weight of the night's ordeal still pressing on his shoulders. Every detail replayed in his mind. The precise timing of Ethan's interventions, the subtle manipulations that had allowed him to regain control, and the moment he had finally confronted Marcus Vale in the office, turning the hunter into the hunted. Despite exhaustion, a quiet satisfaction settled over him, tempered by the understanding that vigilance would always be necessary in a world where ambition could so easily turn into malice. David walked through the office floor, noting the expressions on his employees' faces. Some lingered near the security monitors, replaying footage of the night's events, their eyes wide with disbelief. Others whispered in small clusters, sharing their gratitude and awe at the calm decisiveness that had saved the company. "We were lucky to have leadership like yours," one junior executive said, his voice barely above a whisper. David smiled faintly, placing a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. "It wasn't luck," he replied, his voice steady but carrying the weight of experience. "It was preparation, foresight, and the courage to act when it mattered most." His eyes flicked to the boardroom, where the remaining directors were reviewing financial data and the potential fallout from Marcus's network of manipulation. Even in victory, there was work to be done. Meanwhile, Ethan moved with a quiet confidence through the secured areas, his training and innate analytical skills honed to a razor's edge. The night's adrenaline had faded, but the lessons lingered. Each room he entered, each corridor he passed, reminded him that even in moments of triumph, attention to detail was crucial. He paused at the communication hub, scanning the latest federal messages. Recognition of his quick thinking had arrived in the form of a congratulatory note from his mentor. Yet Ethan's face remained composed, his eyes reflecting the humility that had always defined him. "The danger isn't over," he murmured to himself, tracing the maps of surveillance data, aware that Marcus's influence, though diminished, still had echoes that could resurface. There was no satisfaction in arrogance. There was only the steady vigilance of someone who understood that true security was never absolute. Outside, the city of New Cordelia remained unchanged, its skyline gleaming under the early morning sun. Yet for David and Ethan, the world felt profoundly different. The rooftop of Zenith Core became a vantage point not just of the city, but of reflection. The wind swept past, ruffling David's hair as he stood beside his son. The recent storm etched into their expressions. "You handled yourself remarkably," David said, his voice soft but firm, a mixture of pride and relief. Ethan shrugged slightly, his gaze distant yet steady. "I only did what needed to be done," he replied, his tone calm, but his eyes betrayed the weight of responsibility he had carried. The father-son bond, already strong, had been tempered and strengthened by adversity, their trust in each other now unshakable. In the distance, law enforcement teams finalized a secure perimeter, ensuring that Marcus Vale and his remaining associates were fully detained. Documents were cataloged, communications traced, and assets frozen. David observed the meticulous dismantling of the antagonist's plans, feeling the full scope of what had been at stake. The legal ramifications for Marcus would be severe. His arrogance had been his undoing, and the evidence collected would leave no room for evasion. Yet even with the threat neutralized, David's mind remained alert, reflecting on how easily power could be challenged and how quickly control could be lost if vigilance waned. As the morning grew brighter, David and Ethan shared a rare moment of quiet amidst the lingering tension. The city below bustled, unaware of the night's high-stakes drama, a reminder of how fragile the boundary between chaos and order could be. "We've done what we can for now," David said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Ethan nodded, a mutual understanding passing between them. There was pride, yes, but also the sober realization that strategy, patience, and loyalty were always the pillars that held their world together. In that instant, the skyline of New Cordelia seemed both eternal and newly defined, a mirror of their own evolving perspective on power, trust, and resilience. Together, they looked out over the city from Zenith Corps' rooftop, side by side, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here and the unspoken lessons learned in the crucible of danger. The wind tugged gently at their jackets, carrying with it the faint hum of a city that moved oblivious to the battles fought above its streets. For David, the ordeal was a reaffirmation of his philosophy, that true strength lay not only in intellect or skill, but in the bonds forged with those who stood beside him in moments of uncertainty. Ethan, equally aware, felt the quiet satisfaction of a challenge met and a crisis averted, knowing that vigilance and patience would always be the tools to navigate a world where ambition could turn deadly. Sometimes the strongest defense is not strength alone, but the sharpness of the mind and the loyalty of those who stand beside you. They restrained the CEO and froze when his son stepped in as the federal inspector, turning the tables instantly. If you believe true authority protects the innocent without warning, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights abuse of authority, prejudice, and the moment accountability and truth confront wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, justice, and treating every passenger with dignity and respect.